I am Nia, 32 years old, and on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, I received a gift that shattered my family forever. I was sitting at the head table of my own wedding reception, surrounded by hundreds of guests, when my mother Beatrice handed me a heavy, beautiful Tiffany blue box. When I opened it and found absolutely nothing inside, she leaned into the microphone and announced to the entire room that an empty box for an empty future was exactly what my marriage was worth. My sister and her husband laughed while the rest of the room gasped in horror. I simply closed the box and looked at them. They had no idea that I was about to dismantle their entire lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family that completely underestimated your worth. The Buckhead Country Club was the pinnacle of Atlanta high society. The ballroom was a massive expanse of polished marble floors, soaring ceilings, and crystal chandeliers that caught the light and scattered it across the room like diamonds. Tables were draped in heavy white silk and adorned with towering floral arrangements of white orchids and roses. It was the kind of venue that demanded wealth and status, a place where the city elite gathered to see and be seen. My mother Beatrice had insisted on this location. For her, my wedding was not a celebration of my love for my husband Marcus, but a highly produced social event designed to showcase our family legacy. Marcus sat beside me at the head table, his hand resting warmly over mine. He was a high school principal, a man who dedicated his life to shaping the futures of teenagers in one of the more challenging districts in the city. He was brilliant, compassionate, and grounded. He did not care about designer labels or country club memberships. He cared about me. But to my mother and my younger sister Chloe, his profession was a profound embarrassment. They measured a man's worth entirely by his bank account and his ability to buy social capital. In their eyes, Marcus was a failure, and by extension, my decision to marry him proved that I was the family disappointment. The clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute brought the ambient chatter of the ballroom to a halt. I turned to see my mother standing up from her seat at the adjacent family table. Beatrice was 58, but carried herself with the terrifying grace of a woman who spent a fortune to freeze time. She wore a custom beaded gown that probably cost more than Marcus made in a year. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless, her posture rigid with an air of absolute superiority. In her hands, she carried a box. It was a stunning Tiffany blue box, tied perfectly with a crisp white satin ribbon. The box was surprisingly large and looked heavy. A hush fell over the room. 250 guests turned their attention toward the matriarch of the Caldwell family, expecting a heartwarming mother of the bride speech. I felt a sudden knot tighten in my stomach. My mother never did anything without a calculated motive. She walked slowly toward the head table, the heels of her designer shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. A waiter quickly brought over a wireless microphone. She took it with a practiced smile, looking out over the crowd before her eyes locked onto mine. Family, friends, and distinguished guests. She began, her voice echoing through the massive ballroom. It was a smooth, refined tone dripping with false Southern charm. We are gathered here tonight to witness the union of my eldest daughter, Nia, and Marcus. As a mother, you spend your entire life preparing your children for the real world. You give them the best education, you introduce them to the right people, and you try to instill in them a sense of value, a sense of what they deserve. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. I could feel Marcus tense beside me, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. He knew my family dynamics better than anyone. He knew the subtle poison wrapped in my mother's words. Chloe, my younger sister, was sitting just a few feet away. She was 30 years old, the undisputed golden child of the family. Beside her sat her white husband, Preston, a wealth manager who never missed an opportunity to flaunt his luxury cars and expensive watches. Chloe had a smirk playing on her lips. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, her eyes gleaming with malicious anticipation. She knew exactly what was about to happen. Nia, my mother, continued, turning fully toward me. You have always been so independent, so determined to do things your own way, regardless of the advice or the sacrifices of your family. You chose a very specific path when you chose Marcus. A life of public service. a modest life. The silence in the room shifted from expectant to uncomfortable. Several guests exchanged confused glances. This was not a normal toast. This was a public dissection. As your mother, I wanted to give you a wedding gift that perfectly represents the reality of the life you have chosen today, she said, stepping right up to the head table. She placed the heavy Tiffany blue box directly in front of me. The white satin ribbon was flawless. The weight of the box pressed down on the white silk tablecloth. Go ahead, Nia, she urged, her voice soft but commanding into the microphone. Open it. Let everyone see the foundation of your new marriage. My heart pounded against my ribs. My hands felt unnaturally cold. I looked at Marcus and he gave me a slight nod of support, his eyes filled with a fierce, protective anger. I reached out and pulled the white ribbon. It slipped away effortlessly. I lifted the lid of the box. Inside there was nothing. Not a piece of jewelry, not a key, not a check. It was completely empty. The heaviness of the box had been an illusion created by lead weights glued into the bottom lining just to make it feel substantial. It was an elaborate, carefully constructed prop. I stared into the empty, velvet-lined interior, trying to process the magnitude of the cruelty. It was one thing to criticize me in the privacy of our home. It was an entirely different level of malice to humiliate me in front of hundreds of people on my wedding day. Before I could even process the shock, my mother leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring that every single person in the ballroom heard her next words clearly. "An empty box for an empty future," she announced, her voice suddenly devoid of all that fake charm, replaced by a cold, cutting disdain. "That is exactly what your marriage to this broke high school principal is worth. Nothing." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. It was a physical wave of shock from the guests. A few people actually covered their mouths. The band members standing in the corner froze. Then came the laughter. It was loud, raucous, and deeply ugly. It came from Chloe and Preston. My sister threw her head back and laughed, slapping the table in delight. Preston chuckled heartily, raising his glass of champagne toward my mother, as if to toast her brilliant performance. They were reveling in my humiliation, feeding off the cruelty of the moment. My mother lowered the microphone, a satisfied smirk resting on her face. She looked at me, expecting to see tears. She expected my voice to tremble. She expected me to shrink into myself, apologize, or run out of the room crying. She expected the girl who had spent 3 decades trying to earn her love to finally break. Marcus squeezed my hand so tightly I could feel the pulse in his fingers. He shifted in his seat, preparing to stand up, preparing to defend me. But I placed my other hand over his, stopping him. I did not cry. My vision did not blur. Instead, something inside me simply locked into place. The final thread of hope I had ever held for my mother, for my sister, for this toxic family, snapped and vanished completely. I looked down at the empty box, and then I looked up into my mother's expectant eyes. My face turned to absolute stone. The tears she wanted so desperately to see would never come. I slowly closed the lid of the box, pushed it to the side of the table, and stared directly at her. She thought she had just delivered the ultimate insult. She thought she had won. She had no idea that she had just signed her own financial and social death warrant, and I was going to enjoy every single second of what came next. The silence in the ballroom stretched out, suffocating and heavy. Before the shock could even begin to dissipate, the sound of a chair scraping against the marble floor broke the tension. It was Preston. My sister Chloe's husband slowly stood up, holding his crystal champagne flute. He took his time walking toward the head table, swirling the pale golden liquid in his glass with an arrogant rhythm. Preston was a wealth manager at a massive financial firm, and he wore his unearned confidence like a tailored suit. He had always harbored a deep-seated need to assert his dominance, especially in rooms filled with successful Black professionals. Tonight he clearly saw an opportunity to perform. He stopped right in front of Marcus, looking down at my husband with a pitying smile that made my blood boil. "Come on now, Marcus," Preston said, his voice projecting loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Do not take it so hard, man. We all know the reality of your situation. You are a public servant working in what we will politely call a transitional neighborhood. It is noble work, really it is. But nobility does not pay the mortgage on a Buckhead estate, and it certainly does not buy you a seat at this kind of table." Preston took a slow sip of his champagne, letting the insult sink in. He reached out and condescendingly patted Marcus on the shoulder, a microaggression so blatant it made several of my husband's fraternity brothers stand up from their tables in the back. Marcus did not flinch. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his dignity completely intact. But Preston was not finished. He turned his smug gaze toward me. And Nia, sweetheart, Preston continued shaking his head with fake sympathy. We all know you try your best with your little boutique financial advising firm. It is cute that you want to play business owner, but let us be real here. You and Marcus are completely out of your depth. You are playing in a league you do not have the capital to compete in. Chloe and I understand how the real world works. Wealth is built through aggressive strategy and elite connections, not by pinching pennies on a teacher's salary and running a tiny storefront office. This empty box is just a metaphor for the financial reality you two are going to face. You should be taking notes instead of looking so offended. My mother, Beatrice, nodded in vigorous agreement, stepping right back up to the microphone to reclaim the spotlight. She fed off Preston's arrogance like it was oxygen. Exactly, Preston, she announced, her voice ringing out through the speakers again. This is exactly what I have been trying to tell her for years. Nia, you should be on your knees thanking this family for even showing up today. Beatrice paced back and forth in front of the head table, gesturing wildly to the luxurious surroundings. Look at this room, she demanded. Look at the crystal, the orchids, the silk. I had to pull every favor I had in Atlanta high society just to secure this country club because your budget certainly could not afford it. I lowered my own standards and forced my friends to lower theirs just to sit through this mediocre celebration. You serve chicken and cheap wine at a Caldwell family event and expect us to pretend it is a royal gala. We compromised our elite standing just to support your little budget wedding. The sheer delusion of her words was staggering. I had paid for every single cent of this wedding out of my own pocket, while she had done nothing but complain and invite her snooty friends to drink on my dime. But she was rewriting history in real time, portraying herself as the ultimate martyr. Do you have any idea the sacrifices I made to raise you? Beatrice cried, placing a dramatic hand over her heart. The private schools I paid for, the cotillion classes I forced you to attend, the ballet lessons, the tutors, the networking galas. I poured my life into molding you into a woman of substance, a woman who could marry into real power and elevate the Caldwell name. I gave you every tool to succeed in high society, and you threw it all away. You chose to be ordinary. You chose a man who brings nothing to our family portfolio. You chose to be a disappointment. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, her expression twisting into a mask of pure resentment. I sacrificed my youth and my wealth to build a throne for you, and you decided to sit in the dirt. You owe me your gratitude, Nia. You owe me your respect. And instead you sit there glaring at me as if I am the villain for simply pointing out the truth. Chloe leaned back in her chair, twirling a diamond ring on her finger, her laughter echoing again. She is right, Nia, Chloe chimed in loudly, perfectly happy to twist the knife deeper. You always want to act like you are so independent, but you would be absolutely nothing without the Caldwell name attached to you. You should be apologizing to Mom for embarrassing us with this whole setup. The guests were completely paralyzed. No one knew whether to intervene or remain silent. The air was thick with secondhand embarrassment and outrage. My mother and sister were so wrapped up in their own narcissism that they could not see the disgust on the faces of the people they were trying so desperately to impress. They thought they were asserting their dominance, but all they were doing was proving their own cruelty to the entire city of Atlanta. Preston leaned against the table, crossing his arms and grinning like he had just won a major victory. He looked at Marcus again, a taunting gleam in his eye. Maybe I can get you a job at my firm, Marcus Preston offered loudly enough for everyone to hear. We always need guys to handle the mailroom or organize the files. It would definitely pay better than babysitting juvenile delinquents all day. Marcus shifted his weight, his breathing controlled but heavy. I felt the heat radiating from his skin. He was a proud black man, a highly educated professional who dedicated his life to uplifting the next generation, and he was sitting here being publicly degraded by a mediocre white man who married into my family for status. I kept my hand firmly over my husband's, my grip unyielding. I needed him to wait. I needed him to hold on just a little bit longer because I knew something they did not. They thought they had cornered me. They thought they had stripped me of my dignity and exposed me as a failure. They believed their own lies so deeply that they forgot who they were dealing with. Beatrice took a deep breath, smoothing out the front of her expensive custom gown. She looked out at the silent audience, a triumphant smile returning to her lips. She truly believed she had delivered a masterclass in tough love. She thought she had put me in my place and reminded everyone in the room that she was the absolute authority. "So take your empty box, Nia," she concluded, her voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "Take it and take your husband and go live your small, insignificant life. Just remember that when you inevitably fail, you will not have the Caldwell fortune to fall back on. We are officially washing our hands of your poor decisions." She turned her back to me, preparing to walk away, and returned to her seat in a blaze of toxic glory. Preston pushed off the table, chuckling as he moved to follow her. Chloe clapped her hands together lightly, as if she had just watched a wonderful theatrical performance. They were so incredibly proud of themselves. They had executed their plan perfectly, destroying my wedding day and establishing their perceived superiority. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated me. I slowly pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the marble floor. The sound cut through the ballroom, causing my mother to stop in her tracks and look back over her shoulder. I stood up, smoothing the front of my wedding gown. My heart was beating with a steady, calm rhythm. The fear and hurt had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, calculating focus. I reached out and picked up the microphone that my mother had carelessly left on the edge of the head table. The heavy metal felt cool against my palm. I looked at Marcus and gave him a reassuring smile, a silent promise that everything was about to change. Then I turned my gaze to my mother, my sister, and my arrogant brother-in-law. The time for silence was over. It was time to introduce them to the real Nia Caldwell. I tapped the microphone once, and the sharp thud echoed through the silent ballroom, making my mother freeze in her tracks. She turned around, her custom beaded gown sweeping across the polished marble floor, her eyes wide with sudden apprehension. She had expected me to sit in silence and swallow her poison, just like I had done for the past 3 decades. She expected me to bow my head in shame while the elite families of Atlanta whispered about my failures. But the woman standing before her today was not the obedient scapegoat she had grown so accustomed to abusing. I was not the scared little girl who used to beg for her affection. "Sacrifice's mother," I said, my voice steady and amplified, reaching every single corner of the massive room. "You want to stand in front of Atlanta high society and talk about the sacrifices you made for me. Let us talk about them. Let us lay it all out on this beautiful silk tablecloth for your prestigious friends to see." My mother took a step back, her fake confidence suddenly faltering. The smug smile vanished from her face, replaced by a tight mask of panic. Nia put the microphone down. She hissed, her voice barely carrying over the sound system. "You are making a scene and embarrassing this family in front of our guests." "I am just getting started," I replied, my gaze locked onto hers. "You stood here and told these people that you poured your wealth into my education, that you gave me every tool to succeed and built a throne for me. But we both know that is a complete and utter fabrication. Do you want to tell them the truth, or should I?" The ballroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Hundreds of eyes shifted back and forth between me and my mother. I could see the prominent judges, corporate executives, and megachurch pastors leaning forward in their seats, completely captivated by the unraveling of the Caldwell family facade. The older women in the room, who had spent years listening to my mother brag at their exclusive charity luncheons, were now watching her with narrow, calculating eyes. "Since you are suddenly at a loss for words, I will take the honor." I continued walking slowly around the head table, so there was nothing standing between me and the people who had tried to destroy me. "Let us talk about my acceptance to Howard University, the Mecca of Black excellence. A proud moment for our family legacy, right? You threw a massive party right here in Buckhead, bragging to your sorority sisters about how your eldest daughter was carrying on the Caldwell tradition. But what you conveniently left out of your little speech today was the fact that you secretly drained my entire scholarship fund and my educational trust during my sophomore year." A loud murmur rolled through the crowd. I saw my Aunt Clarissa drop her fork onto her china plate with a loud clatter. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her face had turned an ashen shade of gray. Yes, I said, nodding to the crowd. My own mother intercepted the financial aid checks and drained the educational trust my late grandfather set up for me. And what monumental emergency required you to steal your own daughter's future mother? Was it a medical crisis? Was the family business in jeopardy? I turned my attention to my sister Chloe, who was sitting rigidly at her table, her knuckles white as she gripped her champagne flute. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights. No, I announced, pointing directly at my sister. You drained my tuition money to buy Chloe a limited edition Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag because she threw a temper tantrum about not fitting in with her wealthy friends. And you used the rest of my stolen education fund to pay the deposit on Preston's luxury downtown condo so they could play house while pretending to be wealthy, independent adults. Chloe slammed her hands down on the table and jumped to her feet, her chair crashing backward onto the floor. You are a liar, she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing wildly across the elegant room. You are a jealous, pathetic liar, Nia. Stop trying to ruin my image just because you are a miserable failure. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth does not require shouting. A liar, Chloe? I asked, tilting my head. Then please explain how a 20-year-old college student with zero income and a maxed-out credit card suddenly acquired a $50,000 handbag the exact same week my university account was inexplicably overdrawn. Explain how your dear husband Preston, who at the time was nothing but a glorified intern getting coffee for senior brokers, miraculously came up with an $80,000 down payment for a penthouse in Midtown. Preston stood up, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, trying to maintain his posture of superiority, but his hands were trembling. You need to shut your mouth right now, Nia, he warned, pointing a finger at me. You have no idea what you are talking about. We earned everything we have. We built our wealth from the ground up. Earned it. I laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cut through his fragile ego. You have never earned a single thing in your entire life, Preston. You married into a black family you thought was rich, so you could leech off the Caldwell name and accelerate your mediocre career. And mother was so desperate to have a white wealth manager son-in-law to parade around her country club friends that she gladly financed your fraudulent lifestyle using my stolen money. She bought you that condo so you could pretend you were a self-made man. Beatrice finally found her voice, though it was shaky and stripped of all its previous grandeur. Nia, please, she pleaded, taking a step toward me, her hands outstretched. We can talk about this in private. This is family business. Do not do this in front of our guests. You are ruining your own wedding. Family business, I repeated, shaking my head. No, mother. Family business is what you do when you support each other and build generational wealth. This is corporate fraud and emotional abuse. You did not care about privacy when you handed me an empty box and told me my marriage was worthless in front of 200 people. You wanted an audience. You wanted to humiliate my husband and me to make yourself feel powerful. Well, congratulations, Beatrice. You have their absolute undivided attention. I walked closer to her, refusing to let her look away from me. You forced me to drop out of Howard for an entire semester because I could not pay the tuition. I worked 3 minimum wage jobs, washing dishes, folding clothes in retail, and cleaning offices at night, just to save enough money to re-enroll. While you were hosting charity galas and bragging about your philanthropic efforts, your own daughter was sleeping in her car between shifts because she could not afford campus housing. The guests were visibly horrified. I saw several of my mother's closest friends looking at her with absolute disgust. The polished veneer of the Caldwell matriarch was cracking apart, and underneath everyone could finally see the rotting foundation. Whispers spread through the tables like wildfire. The prominent figures of the community, who had always viewed my mother as a pillar of grace and elegance, were now realizing she was nothing more than a thief who stole from her own child. That is not true, Chloe shrieked, tears of panic streaming down her face. She was desperately trying to salvage her carefully curated rich girl aesthetic in front of her high society peers. Mom, tell them she is lying. Tell them we paid for that condo ourselves. Tell them I bought that bag with my own money. But my mother could not say a word. She was paralyzed, trapped by the exposure of her own dark secrets. She knew that if she denied it, I would just bring out the receipts. And I had the receipts. I had spent years quietly gathering every bank statement, every transfer record, every piece of evidence I needed to prove exactly what she had done to me. You know what the most ironic part of all of this is? I asked, addressing the silent ballroom again. The entire time I was working myself to the bone-sweeping floors and eating instant ramen, just to survive. My mother was telling all of you that I was a troubled child. She told you I lacked ambition. She told you I was squandering my potential. She created a narrative that I was a failure, so that when I could not afford to come home for the holidays or attend your lavish parties, no one would question why I was missing. She painted me as the black sheep to cover up the fact that she had robbed me blind to fund her golden child's delusions of grandeur. Marcus stood up from the head table and walked over to stand right beside me, a silent pillar of unwavering strength. He did not say a word, but he did not have to. His presence alone was a reminder that I was no longer fighting this battle by myself. I had built a real family with a man who loved and respected me, something my mother and sister knew absolutely nothing about. "You are trying to destroy this family," Beatrice suddenly cried out, tears ruining her expensive makeup. "After everything I did to protect our name, you want to tear it all down because of some old financial misunderstanding. I did what I had to do to keep this family afloat, and you are just too selfish to understand." "A misunderstanding," I said, narrowing my eyes. "You deliberately crippled my future to inflate your own ego. You thought because I was quiet, because I chose not to engage in your petty social climbing, that I was weak. You thought I would just disappear into the background and accept the miserable life you planned for me. You thought you could invite me here today, step on my neck, and walk away clean." Chloe was sobbing hysterically now, her perfectly styled hair falling in her face. Preston grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back into her seat, but she yanked away from him. "You are crazy, Nia," Chloe yelled, pointing at me. "You have always been crazy and jealous. You are making all of this up because you hate that I have a better life than you. You hate that Mom loves me more." I looked at my sister, feeling absolutely no pity for the panic destroying her features. "I do not hate you, Chloe," I said, my voice dead calm. "I pity you. You are 30 years old, and you have never accomplished a single thing on your own. Your entire life is subsidized by stolen money and a mother who treats you like a show pony. You are completely dependent on a facade that is crumbling right under your feet." The energy in the room had completely shifted. The initial shock had morphed into a gripping, tense anticipation. No one was eating. No one was drinking. They were entirely focused on the implosion of the Caldwell dynasty. My mother stood frozen, her hands shaking, her eyes darting toward the exit, as if calculating whether she could simply run away. But there was nowhere for her to hide. Her reputation in Atlanta was completely shattered, and she knew it. She had handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy her, and I was using it with absolute precision. I turned my gaze away from my mother, who was now visibly shaking, and locked my eyes onto my brother-in-law. Preston had spent the entire evening strutting around this ballroom like he owned the very air we were breathing. He had mocked my husband. He had mocked my career. He had stood before my family and my friends and proudly flaunted a lifestyle that was nothing but a cheap illusion. Now it was his turn to face the music. Preston noticed the shift in my attention and immediately tried to salvage his crumbling ego. He puffed out his chest and adjusted his tie, a pathetic attempt to project authority in a room that was rapidly realizing he had none. "You can spout all the family drama you want, Nia," he said, his voice laced with a nervous tremor he could not quite hide. "But do not try to drag my name into this. I am a respected wealth manager in this city. I handle portfolios you could not even fathom. You are just lashing out because you know you and Marcus will never reach our level." I smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile that made the remaining color drain entirely from his face. "Oh, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth conversational tone that echoed perfectly through the silent country club. "I know exactly what kind of portfolios you handle. In fact, I know more about your financial situation than your own firm does. And speaking of condos, Preston, how is that elite hedge fund lifestyle treating you these days? Because public records show you took out a $100,000 payday loan last month just to stop the bank from repossessing your Tesla." The collective gasp from the guests was so loud, it sounded like a sudden rush of wind through the ballroom. In Atlanta, high society, there were many sins that could be overlooked, but being broke and faking wealth was absolutely not one of them. The elite crowd in this room, businessmen, politicians, and socialites, despised nothing more than a fraud. Preston stumbled backward, hitting the edge of his table. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The smug, arrogant mask he had worn for years shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes. He looked around the room frantically, hoping to see a friendly face. But the prominent men he had been trying to network with all evening were now staring at him with undisguised contempt. Chloe whipped her head around to look at her husband, her perfect makeup unable to hide the sheer terror spreading across her features. "Preston," she whispered, her voice shrill and trembling. "Preston, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not take out a payday loan. Tell me the car is paid for." But Preston could not speak. He swallowed, hard beads of sweat forming on his forehead. His silence was the loudest confession anyone in the room could have asked for. "I is not going to tell you it is a lie, Chloe, because he knows I brought the receipts," I continued, taking a step closer to their table. "You want to talk about being out of our depth, Preston. You stand here and mock my husband for being a public servant, for working in a neighborhood you look down upon. But my husband owns his car outright. My husband owns his home. My husband does not have to wake up every morning in a cold sweat wondering which debt collector is going to call his office today." I kept my eyes locked on Preston, refusing to grant him even a second of relief. "You married my sister because you thought she was your golden ticket into black generational wealth. You thought the Caldwell name would open doors for you at your firm. You leased a lifestyle you could not afford to impress people who do not even like you. That Rolex on your wrist right now, the one you made sure to flash in the wedding photographer camera all night. It is a very impressive replica. But the jeweler in Midtown who polished it for you last week confirmed it is fake, just like your entire existence." Chloe covered her mouth with her hands, letting out a stifled sob. She looked at the watch on Preston's wrist, as if it had suddenly caught fire. The illusion she had sacrificed my future for was burning to the ground, and she was trapped in the ashes. "You told everyone you bought that luxury condo downtown," I said, shifting my focus back to my sister. "But the down payment was stolen from my education fund, and you two have not paid the mortgage in 3 months. You are drowning in debt, Chloe. Your husband is drowning in debt. And yet you had the absolute audacity to sit at my wedding and laugh at an empty box, while your own bank accounts are completely overdrawn." The humiliation radiating from their table was palpable. I could feel the energy in the ballroom shifting entirely in my favor. The guests who had initially been shocked by my mother handing me that empty box were now nodding in quiet approval. I saw Judge Miller, a close friend of my late grandfather, lean over and whisper something to his wife, shaking his head in disgust as he looked at Preston. I saw Pastor Thomas from the megachurch cross his arms, looking at my mother and sister with absolute pity. "This is none of your business." Preston finally choked out his voice, cracking under the immense pressure of the room. He wiped his sweating forehead with the back of his hand, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors. "You have no right to look into my private finances. You are just a bitter woman trying to ruin our happiness because your own life is miserable." I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head at his pathetic attempt to deflect. "My life is far from miserable, Preston. In fact, my life is exactly what you pretend yours is. But we will get to that in a moment. Right now, I want everyone in this room to understand exactly who had the nerve to mock a black man dedicating his life to education." I turned slightly to look at Marcus. He was sitting tall, his posture relaxed but commanding. He did not need to say a single word to assert his value. His quiet strength contrasted so sharply with Preston's frantic, sweating cowardice that it was almost poetic. Marcus worked 70 hours a week to make sure underprivileged kids had a chance at going to college. He knew the names of every student in his school. He commanded respect simply by walking into a room. And Preston, a man who produced absolutely nothing of value for society, had tried to strip him of his dignity. "You called my husband's career a joke, Preston," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying a dangerous edge. "You said he babysits juvenile delinquents. You reduced the hard work of uplifting our community to a punchline, just so you could feel superior for moving numbers around on a screen. But those kids my husband helps, they have more integrity in their little fingers than you will ever have in your entire life. They work for what they want. You just steal and borrow to fake it. Chloe slammed her hands on the table, tears ruining her expensive mascara. Stop it! She screamed, her voice echoing wildly. Stop talking about us like this. You are just doing this because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of me, Nia. You are jealous because Mom loves me more. You are jealous because I got the big wedding and the expensive ring, and you got a budget party in a room you had to beg for. I looked at my sister, feeling a profound sense of sadness for how deeply she had been brainwashed by our mother's toxic vanity. She was standing in the wreckage of her fake life, finding out her husband was broke, and her only defense was to scream about who was the favorite child. Jealous, I asked, raising an eyebrow. Chloe, look at the man standing next to you. Look at him trembling because his financial house of cards just collapsed. Look at the mother who manipulated you into believing that a designer bag was more important than your sister's education. Look at the hollow fake existence you wake up to every single day. Tell me exactly what part of your life I am supposed to be jealous of. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. She looked at Preston, who was currently staring at his shoes, refusing to meet her eyes. The reality was finally sinking in. She had married a man who used her for her family connections, and now that the money was gone, there was absolutely nothing left between them. You spent your entire life mocking me for being practical. I continued, my voice steady and unwavering. You called me boring. You called me a cheapskate because I did not buy into Mother's obsession with country clubs and designer labels. You thought I was failing because I did not live loudly. But while you and Preston were maxing out credit cards to buy VIP tables at charity galas, I was quietly building my foundation. While you were taking vacations, you could not afford just to post pictures on the internet. I was securing my future. I took a step closer to the center of the room, ensuring that my mother, who was still standing frozen nearby, could hear every single word. You all thought my silence meant I was weak. You thought my refusal to play your toxic family games meant I was losing. But I was not losing. I was watching. I was paying attention to every lie, every stolen dollar, every microaggression Preston threw at my husband, while you all smiled and nodded. Preston tried to muster one last shred of his dignity. He stood up a little straighter, pointing a trembling finger at me. You are going to regret this, Nia. You think you can just stand here and slander me in front of all these people. I work for Vanguard Holdings. I manage millions. When my firm hears about this baseless defamation, my lawyers will sue you into oblivion. You will not have a dime left to your name. I could not help but smile, a genuine bright smile that completely unnerved him. The trap was set and he had walked right into it. I loved how predictably arrogant he was. He was so reliant on his corporate title, so convinced that his position at Vanguard Holdings made him untouchable. I was about to find out exactly how touchable he really was. Sue me, I asked, feigning a look of mild surprise. Preston, I highly doubt you will have the funds to afford a lawyer by the end of tonight. And as for your position at Vanguard Holdings, I think you might want to hold off on threatening people with your corporate connections. Things in the financial sector change so very quickly, do they not? One day, you are pretending to be a master of the universe, and the next day, the entire board of directors finds out exactly what you have been doing with your client's money. Preston froze completely. His finger slowly lowered to his side. The color that had rushed to his face in anger drained away, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored suit. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a new, much more profound terror. He knew what he had done, and judging by the look on his face, he suddenly realized that I knew it too. The elite guests in the room were murmuring intensely now, the scandal too delicious for them to ignore. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Chloe was looking back and forth between me and her husband, totally lost in the rapid escalation of the conflict. My mother, Beatrice, had sunk into a nearby chair, holding her hand to her chest, as if she could physically stop her heart from pounding out of her chest. But the absolute best part of the moment was looking back at my husband. Marcus gave me a slow, proud smile, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. He was watching his wife defend his honor, our marriage, and our future with the kind of ruthless elegance that money simply could not buy. I turned my attention back to the silent, horrified room, preparing to deliver the next blow. The Caldwell family thought they could hand me an empty box and destroy my wedding day, But they were about to learn that the woman they underestimated for 32 years held the keys to their entire existence. The air in the room felt electric, charged with the kind of reckoning that only comes once in a lifetime. I had spent years watching my family operate behind a veil of deceit, treating me like collateral damage in their quest for status. Now that veil was torn to shreds, and the harsh light of reality was exposing every single one of their flaws. I took a deep breath, savoring the quiet victory of this moment, but knowing my work was not quite done. Preston and Chloe were unraveling beautifully piece by piece just as I intended, and I was more than ready for the next act to begin. Preston could not handle the silence. The weight of the room pressing down on him was too much for his fragile ego to bear. He had spent his entire adult life relying on the illusion of power, and now that I had stripped it away, he reverted to the only tactic he had left: pure, unfiltered intimidation. His face morphed from a pale ghost into a deep, blotchy crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against the collar of his expensive custom shirt. He took a step forward, closing the distance between his table and where I stood. He reached a trembling hand into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He held it up in the air, brandishing it like a weapon. It was a pathetic display of desperation. He was a cornered animal trying to bare its teeth at the very person holding the keys to the cage. He looked past me and directed his furious gaze straight at my husband. Marcus did not even blink. He sat there with the calm, steady demeanor of a man who had faced down much worse threats than a mediocre wealth manager throwing a temper tantrum at a country club. "Do you think this is a game?" Preston shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the strain of his own rage. "Do you really think you can stand there and disrespect me in front of these people? You are nothing, Marcus. You are a glorified babysitter in a failing public school system. You do not belong in this room, and you certainly do not get to look down on me. I have connections in this city that you cannot even comprehend. I play golf with members of the city council. I dine with the Board of Education. I have the personal cell phone numbers of the men who write your paychecks." Preston took another step forward, jabbing his phone in the direction of the head table. "I will make one phone call, Marcus. Just one single phone call. And I promise you that by Monday morning, you will be cleaning out your desk. You will be blacklisted from every school district in the state of Georgia. You will never work in education again. I will make sure you lose your pension, your reputation, and everything you have spent your pathetic little life trying to build. You messed with the wrong family today." Then he turned his frantic eyes back to me. His breathing was heavy and ragged. "And as for you, Nia," he sneered, spitting my name out like it was a curse. "You think you are so smart with your little boutique financial firm. You think because you leased a tiny office space you are suddenly a titan of industry. I know people at the IRS. I will trigger an audit so deep and so aggressive that your insignificant business will be buried in legal fees before the end of the fiscal year. I will personally see to it that you are bankrupted and humiliated. You are going to lose everything." The ballroom was absolutely still. The tension was so thick it felt like it could suffocate us all. My mother Beatrice sat frozen in her chair, her eyes darting nervously between Preston and me. Chloe was staring at her husband with a mixture of hope and terror, desperately wanting to believe that his threats held actual weight. The prominent Black politicians and business leaders in the room watched this display with cold, calculating eyes. They recognized exactly what Preston was doing. He was a white man trying to weaponize his perceived systemic power to destroy a successful Black couple who had dared to hold him accountable. It was a scene they had all witnessed before in corporate boardrooms and country clubs across the South. But today was going to end very differently. I did not raise my voice. I did not step back. I simply crossed my arms over the bodice of my wedding gown and looked at him with absolute profound boredom. The sheer stillness of my posture seemed to infuriate him even more. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to beg. He wanted Marcus to lose his temper and validate the aggressive narrative Preston was trying to spin. But we gave him nothing. We just let him drown in the echo of his own pathetic threats. "Make the call, Preston," I said. My voice was smooth and even, cutting through the heavy silence of the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. "Go ahead. Hold that phone up and make the call. Call the city council. Call the Board of Education. Call your friends at the IRS. Tell them that the sister-in-law you have been stealing from finally exposed you at her wedding. Tell them that you need a favor to cover up your own financial ruin. I am sure they will be thrilled to take your call on a Saturday evening. In fact, I insist that you do it right now. Put them on speakerphone so all of Atlanta high society can hear exactly how much power you really have. Preston stared at me. His thumb hovered over the screen of his phone, but he did not press a single button. The bluff was called and he had absolutely nothing in his hand. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tailored jacket. The realization that his threats were bouncing off me like water off a stone was slowly starting to short-circuit his brain. But before you dial the Board of Education, I continued tilting my head slightly. You might want to make a different call first. You might want to dial the compliance department at your own firm. Preston froze. His entire body went completely rigid, as if a sudden surge of electricity had locked every muscle in his frame. His arm, which had been holding the phone high in the air, slowly began to lower. The deep crimson color of his face instantly vanished, replaced by a sickly pale white. The sweat on his forehead seemed to turn to ice. He stopped breathing. The silence in the room stretched out second after second as the true meaning of my words crashed down on him like a physical blow. Compliance. The word hung in the air, hovering over his table like a death sentence. In the wealth management sector, there was no word more terrifying. Compliance meant internal investigations. Compliance meant audits of client portfolios. Compliance meant the end of a career, the loss of licenses, and very often the beginning of a federal indictment. Preston knew this better than anyone. He knew exactly what he had been doing behind the closed doors of Vanguard Holdings. He knew about the shifted funds, the forged client signatures, the unauthorized transfers he had made to fund his luxury condo and his wife's designer wardrobe. He thought he had covered his tracks perfectly. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. Chloe looked at her husband, her perfect acrylic nails digging into the silk tablecloth. "What does she mean, Preston?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling with a fresh wave of panic. "What is compliance? Why are you looking like that? Tell her she is lying. Tell her you are going to call your lawyers." But Preston could not even look at his wife. His eyes were locked onto mine, wide and terrified. His mouth opened slightly, but the arrogant threats had completely evaporated, leaving him entirely speechless. His phone slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the marble floor. He did not even try to pick it up. He just stood there staring at me as the realization washed over him. I knew. I knew everything. I knew about the missing money. I knew about the doctored accounts. I knew about the illegal payday loans. And more importantly, he realized that if I knew about the compliance department, I had the power to detonate his entire life with a single word. My mother Beatrice finally found the strength to stand up. Her knees wobbled slightly as she pushed her chair back. "Nia, what have you done?" she gasped, her voice shrill and desperate. "What kind of lies are you spreading about your brother-in-law? You are destroying your sister's marriage just to be vindictive. You need to stop this right now before you ruin the Caldwell name forever." I slowly turned my gaze to my mother. Her obsession with the family name was a sickness that had infected every single decision she had ever made. "I am not destroying anything, Mother," I said, my tone devoid of any sympathy. "I am simply holding a mirror up to the destruction you and your favorite child have already caused. You wanted an empty box. You wanted a public spectacle. You wanted to show all your wealthy friends that I was the family failure because I refused to marry a man with a fraudulent bank account. Well, this is the spectacle you ordered. You built your entire social standing on the back of Preston's fake career, and now you get to watch it burn to the ground." The guests were absolutely captivated. No one moved toward the exits. No one reached for their coats. They were witnessing the total annihilation of a man who had spent the last 5 years acting superior to everyone in the Buckhead area. The prominent attorneys in the room were already leaning in, whispering to their spouses about the legal implications of what I had just revealed. The banking executives were staring at Preston with absolute disgust, realizing that the man they had played golf with was nothing but a common thief. The facade of the untouchable Preston was gone, and there was no amount of gaslighting or manipulation that could ever put it back together. "You see, Preston," I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step away from the head table. "The financial world in Atlanta is remarkably small. When you move money that does not belong to you, it leaves a digital footprint. It leaves a trail of breadcrumbs that someone with the right access and the right skills can follow very easily. You spent so much time mocking my little boutique firm that you never once bothered to look up what my firm actually does. You never looked at our client roster. You never looked at our acquisitions. You were so blinded by your own arrogance and your deep-seated need to feel superior to a black woman that you walked right into a trap that has been waiting for you for months." Chloe was crying openly now. The tears were ruining the flawless makeup she had spent hours having professionally applied. She grabbed Preston's sleeve, shaking his arm. "Say something," she begged him, her voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "Preston, say something to her. Tell everyone she is crazy." Preston slowly pulled his arm away from his wife. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping completely. The fight was entirely gone from him. The man who had marched up to the head table just minutes ago, ready to destroy my husband's career, was now a hollow shell. He knew that if I had the proof to back up my claims, calling his bluff would result in immediate criminal charges. He knew that the moment the compliance department looked into his files, his life as a free man would be over. The country club memberships, the luxury cars, the penthouse condo, it was all going to be seized. The complete destruction of Preston's ego was a beautiful thing to witness. For years he had paraded through our family gatherings, dropping subtle insults and backhanded compliments designed to remind everyone that he believed he was inherently better than us. He had used his proximity to our family to network with black excellence, while secretly despising the very people who welcomed him into their homes. And my mother had enabled every single second of it. She had allowed this man to sit at her dining table and disrespect her eldest daughter, because his presence validated her desperate need to feel close to white corporate power. She had sold out her own flesh and blood for the illusion of status. But now the curtain had been pulled back. Everyone in the room could see the ugly, rotting truth that had been hiding behind Preston's tailored suits and Chloe's designer handbags. The silence in the ballroom was no longer born of shock, it was born of anticipation. The guests could feel the shift in the atmosphere. They knew that the dynamic of the Caldwell family had just been permanently, irrevocably altered. Marcus reached out and took my hand again, his strong fingers lacing through mine. He did not gloat. He did not gloat over Preston's defeat. He simply stood by my side, a quiet testament to the kind of authentic love and partnership my mother and sister could never comprehend. We were a united front, an unbreakable bond that no empty box and no empty threats could ever dismantle. Preston remained frozen, his eyes darting toward the grand double doors at the back of the ballroom, measuring the distance, wondering if he could simply run away and escape the consequences of his actions. But there was nowhere for him to run. His career was over, his reputation was destroyed, and his marriage was about to collapse under the weight of his financial crimes. My mother continued to stare at me, her face a portrait of complete and utter devastation. She had orchestrated this entire reception to humiliate me, to put me in my place, and to elevate Chloe as the superior daughter. Instead, she had orchestrated the public execution of her own legacy. The Caldwell name she guarded so fiercely was now associated with fraud, theft, and profound embarrassment. She had handed me the microphone expecting me to cry, but I had used it to set her fake empire ablaze. The flames were rising higher and higher, consuming every lie she had ever told, and I was standing in the center of the inferno, completely unbothered, watching it all burn down to the ground. The room waited in breathless suspense for the next move, wondering how this night could possibly escalate any further. The silence in the ballroom was so absolute that when the first sound broke it, it felt like a gunshot. It was a rhythmic, heavy tapping, a solid piece of polished wood striking the marble floor of the Buckhead Country Club. Tap, pause, tap, pause. The sound originated from the very back of the ballroom, from the private alcove reserved for the most esteemed guests. The crowd of wealthy Atlanta elite parted like the Red Sea. No one dared to breathe. No one dared to even adjust their posture. They all knew that sound. They all knew exactly who was rising from her seat. Nana Josephine Caldwell was 78 years old, but she possessed the terrifying, majestic presence of an ancient queen. She was the true matriarch of the Caldwell dynasty, the woman who had built the family fortune alongside my late grandfather decades ago. While my mother Beatrice chased designer labels and superficial country club approval, Nana Josephine was the one who actually owned the land the country club sat on. She wore a simple tailored black silk suit with a single strand of genuine pearls that cost more than Preston's entire fake life. She did not need to shout to command a room. Her mere existence demanded complete and utter submission. She walked slowly down the center aisle, leaning slightly on her intricately carved wooden cane. Every time the cane struck the marble, the resounding thud echoed through the silent ballroom, feeling like a ticking clock counting down the final seconds of my mother's reign of terror. Preston was practically shrinking into the floor, trying to make himself invisible as she passed his table. He had once tried to pitch his fraudulent wealth management services to her, and she had laughed him right out of her estate. He knew better than anyone that Nana could destroy a man with a single phone call. Chloe had stopped her pathetic sobbing, covering her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with absolute dread. They both knew that when Nana Josephine made an appearance, someone was about to be destroyed. My mother Beatrice suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she scrambled away from her chair, rushing toward the center aisle to intercept the matriarch. She plastered on a desperate, frantic smile, trying to maintain the illusion that she was still in control of this disastrous wedding reception. Mama Beatrice stammered, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. "Mama, please let me handle this. Nia is just having one of her episodes. She is confused and upset about her budget wedding. Let me escort you back to your table before she disrespects you too." Nana Josephine did not stop walking. She did not even slow her pace. As Beatrice reached out a shaking hand to touch her arm, Nana simply stopped and turned her head. She delivered a single lethal glare that was so cold and so utterly devoid of any maternal affection that my mother physically recoiled. It was a look of absolute disgust, a look that stripped away every ounce of fake prestige Beatrice had ever claimed. "Do not touch me, Nana," said her voice, a low, raspy whisper that somehow carried perfectly through the dead silent room. "And do not ever speak to me about respect when you have spent the last 30 years disgracing the name my husband built. You are a fool, Beatrice, and tonight you have finally shown the whole world exactly how foolish you are." Beatrice crumpled. The fake Southern Belle persona, the arrogant snob who had handed me an empty box just 20 minutes ago, completely vanished. She shrank back, stepping out of the aisle, her head bowed in absolute shame. The guests watched in stunned fascination as the woman who had terrorized her own daughter was reduced to a cowering child with just one look from the true boss of the family. The high society friends who had cheered on her cruel jokes were now looking at her with nothing but pity and contempt. Nana Josephine continued her slow, deliberate walk until she reached the head table where Marcus and I were standing. Marcus immediately stepped to the side, pulling out a chair for her with the utmost respect. Nana gave my husband a small approving nod, acknowledging the quiet dignity he had maintained throughout this entire circus. She had always liked Marcus. She recognized his genuine character long before my mother decided to hate him for his lack of a corporate title. Then she turned her sharp, calculating eyes to me. There was no pity in her gaze. There was only a fierce, blazing pride. She had been watching this entire ordeal from the back of the room, waiting to see if I had the strength to finally stand up for myself. I had proven that I possessed the Caldwell fire, and she was here to reward it. Tucked under her left arm was a box. It was not wrapped in shiny paper or tied with a crisp white satin ribbon. It was a heavy, solid mahogany box, polished to a deep, rich shine with brass hinges that looked antique and formidable. It looked like a vault. It looked like history. Nana placed the mahogany box directly onto the silk tablecloth, right next to the cheap fake Tiffany box my mother had given me earlier. The heavy wooden box landed with a solid thud that seemed to vibrate through the table. The contrast between the two objects told the entire story of my family. One was a hollow, fragile illusion meant for show. The other was solid, heavy, and undeniably real. Nana reached out and placed her weathered hand over mine. Her skin was soft, but her grip was incredibly strong, providing a surge of grounded energy that I desperately needed. She leaned forward, pulling the microphone closer to her. She did not look out at the crowd. She did not look at my mother or my sister. She looked only at me. "It is time to take out the trash, granddaughter," she whispered into the microphone, her voice rumbling with a dark, satisfying promise. "Open it. Show them what real power in this family looks like." The words hung in the air, wrapping around the room like a heavy velvet cloak. No one dared to make a sound. The collective breath of 250 elite guests was held in check by the sheer gravity of Nana's command. This was not just a wedding anymore. This was the dismantling of a toxic hierarchy that had plagued my life since childhood. Nana had always been the silent observer, the wise matriarch who sat back and watched the true nature of her descendants reveal itself. She had seen Beatrice prioritize designer labels over maternal love. She had watched Chloe transform into a spoiled, entitled brat who believed the world owed her a living. And she had watched me, the quiet, practical granddaughter, absorb their abuse while silently building my own empire. For years, I thought Nana was simply indifferent to the family drama. I thought she tolerated my mother's behavior because it was easier than fighting it. But as I looked into her sharp, discerning eyes, I realized she had been waiting for this exact moment. She had been waiting for the day I finally refused to be the sacrificial lamb for their vanity. She had been gathering her own receipts, pulling her own strings, and preparing the ultimate counterstrike for the day. My mother crossed the point of no return. Handing the box in front of all these people was the catalyst that brought the true queen of the Caldwell dynasty off her throne. The solid mahogany box sat before me, its brass latch gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. It was my grandfather's old lockbox, the one he used to keep his most important deeds and contracts in. Just looking at it sent a surge of adrenaline through my veins. This was the tangible proof of generational wealth and unyielding authority. This was the very thing my mother and sister had spent their entire lives pretending to possess, but could never actually touch. They wanted to play games with fake Tiffany boxes and hollow threats, but Nana was bringing the full heavy weight of reality crashing down onto their perfectly manicured heads. I reached out and rested my fingers on the cool, polished wood. The brass latch was cold and firm. I could feel the eyes of every single person in that ballroom burning into my back. Beatrice was standing a few feet away, clutching her chest, her face a portrait of impending doom. She knew that whatever was inside that mahogany box was going to end her. Chloe was gripping Preston's arm so tightly, her knuckles were stark white, but Preston was too paralyzed by his own looming destruction to even comfort his wife. They were watching their fragile house of cards sway in the wind, waiting for the final gust that would blow it all away. Nana gave my hand one last squeeze before stepping back to give me the stage. She stood tall and proud, leaning on her cane, a silent guardian watching over the execution of justice. Marcus placed a comforting hand on my lower back, his silent support grounding me in the present moment. I took a deep breath, letting the sweet taste of victory fill my lungs before I even opened the lid. I unfastened the brass latch with a sharp click. The sound was tiny, but in the dead silence of the room, it echoed like a gavel striking a sounding block. I slowly lifted the heavy wooden lid and looked inside. The contents of the box were immaculate. There was a stack of thick legal documents bound by a single gold clip, each page stamped with official red seals that denoted absolute verified authority. Resting on top of the documents was a sleek silver USB drive. These were not just papers. These were the instruments of absolute ruin for the people who had tried to ruin me. I looked down at the documents, reading the bold black text on the first page, and a slow, knowing smile spread across my face. Nana had outdone herself. She had not just found their secrets, she had legally weaponized them. I looked back up in the crowd, letting my gaze sweep across the sea of expectant faces. Then I locked eyes with Preston. His breathing had become shallow and erratic. He looked like a man standing on the gallows waiting for the lever to be pulled. I reached into the mahogany box and pulled out the first document, holding it up so the bright lights of the ballroom could illuminate the official seals. It was time to finish what my mother had started. It was time to show everyone in Atlanta high society that the quiet daughter, the one they mocked for marrying a school principal, was actually the one holding the deed to their entire miserable existence. The empty box my mother had given me was still sitting on the table, a pathetic reminder of her failed attempt to break my spirit. I pushed it aside, letting it slide off the edge of the table and tumble onto the floor. No one even looked at it. All eyes were on the heavy mahogany box and the documents I held in my hand. The Caldwell family had built their entire identity on the illusion of power, but they were about to learn a very painful lesson. True power does not need to boast. True power does not need to humiliate others to feel strong. True power waits patiently in the shadows, gathering evidence and silently acquiring the very ground its enemies stand on. And right now, I was holding the ground that Preston, Chloe, and Beatrice had built their fake lives upon. It was finally time to take out the trash. I looked down at the documents in my hand, feeling the heavy, high-quality paper between my fingertips. The red seals glared under the ballroom lights, representing a finality that Preston could not talk his way out of. The room was so quiet that I could hear the ice melting in the water glasses on the tables nearby. I let my eyes slowly travel from the documents to Preston. He was gripping the edge of his table, his knuckles completely white, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. He knew something terrible was coming, but his arrogant mind still could not fully process that the architect of his destruction was the very black woman he had spent the last 5 years trying to belittle. "Preston," I called out, my voice steady and echoing clearly through the sound system. "Earlier tonight you had a lot to say about my career. You were incredibly eager to stand in front of my family, my friends and my husband to mock my boutique financial advising firm. You puffed out your chest and bragged about your prestigious position at Vanguard Holdings. You told us all that you manage millions and that you play in a league we could never possibly compete in." I took a slow step forward, holding the first document up so he could see the bold black text at the top of the page. "It is funny how corporate pride works, Preston. You get so wrapped up in your fancy title and your corner office that you completely forget to pay attention to who actually owns the building you are standing in. You see, the financial world is ruthless, and there is always a bigger fish swimming in the water. Vanguard Holdings has been struggling for months. Your board of directors was desperate for a bailout to avoid a complete public collapse, so they quietly put the firm up for sale, hoping a private equity giant would swoop in and save them from bankruptcy." I watched Preston's eyes dart back and forth, his brain trying to catch up to the words coming out of my mouth. The prominent bankers and investors sitting at the guest tables were leaning forward, now completely captivated by the corporate espionage unfolding at a wedding reception. "And a private equity giant did swoop in." I continued, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. "Last week, Vanguard Holdings was officially acquired in a hostile takeover. The ink dried on Thursday. Your firm no longer exists as an independent entity, Preston. It is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Apex Capital." The name Apex Capital sent a visible shockwave through the elite members of the audience. Everyone in Atlanta high society knew that name. Apex Capital was a massive, faceless investment firm that had been buying up commercial real estate, struggling tech startups, and vulnerable financial institutions all across the East Coast for the past 4 years. They were known for being ruthless, incredibly well-funded, and completely anonymous. No one knew who the founder was. The corporate structure was hidden behind layers of trusts and shell companies designed specifically to protect the privacy of the owner. Preston swallowed hard, his throat working visibly as he tried to speak. "What does Apex Capital have to do with this?" he croaked, his voice thin and trembling. "Why are you talking about my firm?" I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head at his sheer blindness. "Preston," I said, dropping the document onto the table and leaning closer to the microphone. "Guess who the anonymous founder and CEO of Apex Capital is?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a massive explosion. I locked eyes with him, refusing to let him look away as I delivered the fatal blow. "It is me, Preston," I said, my voice ringing with undeniable absolute authority. "I am the founder. I am the CEO. I am the sole majority shareholder of Apex Capital. The owner of the tiny little firm you just spent 10 minutes mocking is the exact same woman who just bought your entire miserable company. I am your boss, Preston. I own you." The reaction was instantaneous and deafening. A collective gasp ripped through the 250 guests. Several finance executives sitting near the back actually jumped out of their seats, staring at me with a mixture of profound shock and newfound reverence. Chloe let out a high-pitched squeak, covering her mouth as the reality of my wealth finally registered in her vacant mind. My mother, Beatrice, looked like she had just been struck by lightning, her jaw hanging wide open, unable to comprehend that the daughter she had just handed an empty box to was a verified titan of industry. But Preston was the most beautiful sight of all. His face crumpled. His eyes widened to the point where I thought they might pop out of his skull. His brain was short-circuiting, entirely unable to reconcile his deep-seated racist and sexist prejudices with the cold hard fact that a black woman he despised was actually a multimillionaire who controlled his paycheck. But I was not finished. Buying his firm was just the setup. The actual execution was still waiting in the mahogany box. I turned back to the solid wooden box resting on the table and reached inside, my fingers closing around the small, sleek silver USB drive. I pulled it out and held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting the crystal chandelier light catch the metal. "You see, Preston," I continued, my tone shifting from conversational to deadly serious. "When you acquire a financial institution, you do not just buy their assets. You buy their liabilities. You buy their internal records. You buy complete unrestricted access to every single client portfolio, every transaction log, and every hidden account that the previous management failed to monitor properly." When Apex Capital took over Vanguard Holdings, I ordered a comprehensive forensic audit of all senior wealth managers. And because I knew exactly who you were, I had my best investigators start with your files. Preston's knees actually buckled slightly. He reached out and grabbed the back of Chloe's chair to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. He knew what was on that drive. The arrogant facade was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, primal terror of a man facing a lengthy federal prison sentence. "This drive," Preston, I announced, pointing the silver rectangle directly at him. "This drive contains irrefutable, undeniable proof of the $2 million you embezzled from your own clients over the past 3 years." Chloe screamed, a sharp, piercing sound of pure panic. She grabbed Preston's arm, shaking him violently. "Preston, tell her she is lying," Chloe begged, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Tell her you did not steal $2 million. Tell them we are rich, Preston." But Preston could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his eyes glued to the USB drive in my hand like it was a loaded gun pointed right at his chest. I did not stop. I kept the pressure on, relentless and unforgiving. "You stole from the elderly, Preston. You forged signatures on withdrawal slips from pension funds, and you transferred the money into offshore accounts, hoping no one would ever notice the discrepancies. And what did you do with all that stolen money? Did you invest it? Did you build something of value? No. You used it to fund Chloe's ridiculous lifestyle so my mother would think you were successful. You bought that fake Rolex. You paid the lease on that luxury Tesla. You bought first-class tickets to Dubai and $1,000 shoes just to pretend you belonged in this room. You funded a complete illusion using money that belonged to hardworking people who trusted you with their life savings." The guests were absolutely horrified. Stealing from clients was the ultimate unforgivable sin in their world. The whispers turned into loud, angry mutters. People were pulling out their phones, probably texting their own financial advisors to make sure their accounts were secure. Preston was now a pariah, a walking disease that no one in Atlanta high society would ever touch again. "You threatened my husband tonight," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You stood at my wedding and told the man I love that you would have him fired by Monday morning. You thought your connections made you a god. But your connections cannot save you from federal crimes, Preston. Your golf buddies on the city council are not going to answer your calls when they find out you are under criminal investigation. Preston opened his mouth, a pathetic whimpering sound escaping his throat. "Naya, please," he choked out, his voice sounding like gravel. "Please do not do this. I can pay it back, I can fix it, just keep it internal." "It is far too late for that," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You see, Preston? I do not make empty threats. I do not stand in a ballroom and scream about what I'm going to do. I handle my business before I ever open my mouth. This USB drive in my hand is just a backup copy. The original drive, containing every single forged document, every illegal wire transfer, and every piece of communication between you and your offshore accounts, was handed directly to the white-collar crime division of the FBI exactly 2 hours ago." Preston gasped, clutching his chest like he was having a heart attack. Chloe let go of his arm and physically backed away from him, her eyes wide with terror as she realized her husband was going to federal prison and taking her fake rich lifestyle down with him. "And as for your employment at Vanguard Holdings," I concluded, delivering the final absolute blow. "Human Resources processed the paperwork while we were all eating dinner. Your access to the building has been revoked. Your company phone has been wiped remotely. Your accounts are frozen. You are officially terminated, Preston. You have absolutely nothing left." Preston was holding his crystal champagne flute in his right hand. As the reality of his total absolute destruction finally set in, his fingers went completely numb. The expensive crystal glass slipped from his grasp. It fell in slow motion, tumbling through the heavy silence of the ballroom. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, violent crash. The glass shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, sending pale golden champagne splashing across the floor and onto the polished tips of his expensive leather shoes. The sound of the shattering glass was the perfect punctuation to the end of his life. He stared down at the broken pieces, his mind entirely broken right along with them. He had walked into this wedding as an arrogant predator looking for easy prey. He had tried to humiliate a black man and tear down a black woman just to feed his own massive insecurities. And in return, I had dismantled his career, his freedom, and his marriage in less than 5 minutes. He slowly fell to his knees, ignoring the sharp shards of crystal pressing through his suit pants. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, pathetic sobs. The great Preston, the master of the universe, the wealth manager, who thought he was better than all of us, was reduced to a crying heap on the floor of a country club he could no longer afford to step foot inside. Marcus stood beside me, radiating a quiet, immense pride. He did not gloat or laugh, he just watched the man who had insulted him face the devastating consequences of his own arrogance. Behind me, I heard the heavy wooden tap of Nana Josephine's cane. She stepped up to the table, looking down at Preston with an expression of pure, unfiltered satisfaction. "I told you," she whispered, her voice carrying a dark, joyful hum. "I told you it was time to take out the trash." I looked out at the guests who were still staring at me with mouths agape. I had their complete respect now. Not because I was born into the Caldwell family, but because I had proven that I was the apex predator in the room. But I was not finished yet. Preston was just the appetizer. The main course was still sitting in her chair, clutching her chest and watching her fake empire burn. I turned my eyes away from the broken man on the floor and locked my gaze onto my mother, Beatrice. It was time to show her exactly what an empty box really felt like. I left Preston kneeling in the shards of his own shattered ego and walked slowly back to the mahogany box. The ballroom remained utterly paralyzed. The prominent members of Atlanta high society, who had spent decades kissing my mother's ring, were now watching her with predatory fascination. They smelled blood in the water. Beatrice Caldwell, the self-proclaimed Queen of Buckhead, was cornered, and everyone in the room knew she was next. My mother was struggling to maintain her composure. Her chest heaved under her expensive custom gown, and her hands fluttered nervously near her throat. She tried to paste on that familiar condescending smile, but her facial muscles refused to cooperate. The mask was slipping. She had watched me systematically destroy her golden son-in-law in less than 5 minutes, and the terrifying reality that she no longer held any power over me was finally crashing through her delusions. I reached my hand back into the deep, polished interior of Nana's mahogany box. My fingers brushed against the thick parchment of the second document. This was the real prize. This was the executioner's axe that would finally sever my mother's toxic grip on our family legacy. I pulled the document out and held it up. Unlike the corporate buyout papers, this one had a very specific, very recognizable blue border. It was a property deed. I looked at my mother, letting the silence stretch out until it became physically painful for her. "Did you really think you were still high society, Mother?" I asked, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Did you honestly believe you could stand in this room and talk down to my husband about poverty when your own financial house is burning to the ground?" Beatrice took a shaky step backward. "Nia, stop this!" She pleaded, her voice thin and reedy, stripping away all the fake Southern Belle charm she had weaponized for decades. "You have made your point. You proved you are successful. Please just put the papers away and let us save whatever dignity this family has left." "Dignity," I echoed, letting out a sharp, cold laugh. "You forfeited your dignity the moment you handed me an empty box on my wedding day. You wanted to talk about my future mother. You wanted to talk about empty bank accounts and struggling public servants. So let us talk about your bank accounts. Let us talk about the majestic Caldwell estate in Buckhead that you have been parading around in like you own the place." The murmur in the crowd grew louder. The Caldwell estate was a legendary property. My mother had hosted charity galas, wine tastings, and political fundraisers in that mansion for over 20 years. It was the absolute center of her identity. It was the physical manifestation of the elite black wealth she constantly lorded over everyone else. "You love that house, do you not, Mother?" I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. You love the grand staircase and the marble columns. You love making the domestic staff serve you breakfast on the terrace. You love it so much that you were willing to do absolutely anything to keep it when your massive credit card debts finally caught up to you. You took out a second mortgage 5 years ago to pay for Chloe's ridiculous lifestyle. And then when that money ran out, you got desperate. My mother shook her head frantically, her eyes wide with terror. "No," she whispered. But it was so quiet that no one could hear her. She raised her shaking hands as if she could physically block the words coming out of my mouth. "You took out a secret third mortgage," I announced, projecting my voice so every single one of her wealthy friends could hear the undeniable truth. "You leveraged the very walls of that house to a predatory lending firm just to keep up appearances. You borrowed against the family legacy, just so you could keep buying custom gowns and hosting luncheons you could not afford. And because you have not had a real source of income in years, you defaulted 6 months ago." The collective gasp from the ballroom was louder this time. In the elite circles of Atlanta, bankruptcy was a quiet rumor, but foreclosure was an absolute unforgivable scandal. Beatrice's closest friends, the women she had gossiped with and judged others with, were now staring at her in profound shock. The illusion of the wealthy, untouchable Caldwell matriarch was completely destroyed. She had been feeding them lies for years, pretending to be royalty, while drowning in massive toxic debt. "The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings 90 days ago." I continued, ruthlessly reading from the document in my hand. "You have been living in a house that the bank essentially owned, checking the mail every morning, in a panic, terrified that an eviction notice was going to be taped to the front door. You were broke, Mother. You were completely financially ruined." Beatrice let out a choked sob, covering her face with her hands. She could not look at me. She could not look at her friends. She was entirely exposed. The fear of losing her social standing had driven her to steal my college fund, and now that same fear was paralyzing her in front of the exact audience she wanted to impress. But I was not finished. The best part of the story was yet to come. I turned my gaze toward Nana Josephine, who was still standing tall and proud by the head table, resting her hands on her carved wooden cane. "But Nana watches everything," I said, a genuine smile softening my face for just a fraction of a second before I turned back to my mother. "Nana knew exactly what you were doing. She watched you bleed this family dry to fund your ridiculous vanity. She saw you mortgage the family estate to pay for Preston's fake lifestyle. So when the lending firm listed the debt, Nana used her own private trust to buy the note. She paid off the bank entirely. She bought your debt, Mother. Which means the bank no longer owns your house." For one brief, pathetic second, my mother dropped her hands from her face. A glimmer of desperate, foolish hope sparked in her tear-filled eyes. She actually thought Nana had saved her. She thought the true matriarch had stepped in to protect the family name and keep a roof over her head. She thought the rich traditions of the Caldwell dynasty had shielded her from the consequences of her own financial incompetence. Oh, Mama! Beatrice breathed out a ragged sigh of relief, taking a trembling step toward the older woman. Thank you. Thank you so much. I promise I will pay the trust back. I will. Nana Josephine did not even blink. She just stared at my mother with a look of absolute stone-cold disgust. She did not offer a single word of comfort. She simply tapped her wooden cane once against the marble floor, a sharp cracking sound that instantly killed the hope in my mother's eyes. I held up the deed, waving the thick paper in the air to draw my mother's attention back to me. She did not buy the house to save you, Mother, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal quiet. She bought the house to evict you. Beatrice froze. The foolish hope drained entirely from her face, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated terror. She stared at the document in my hand, her chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked breaths. Nana bought the debt, I explained, enunciating every single word with deliberate precision, ensuring there was no room for misunderstanding. And then she transferred the deed to my name, as a wedding gift. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the distant sound of traffic outside the country club, but inside the ballroom, no one dared to breathe. I looked down at the document in my hand, and then back at the woman who had tormented me for my entire life. I am the sole legal owner of the Caldwell estate, Mother. I own the mansion. I own the grounds. I own the roof over your head. You are standing here mocking my marriage, holding up an empty box and pretending you are royalty when in reality you are completely broke and homeless. Beatrice's knees buckled. It was not a dramatic theatrical swoon meant to garner sympathy. It was the raw physical collapse of a woman whose entire universe had just been vaporized. Her legs simply gave out beneath the weight of her massive, undeniable failure. She crashed to the marble floor, the heavy beads of her custom gown clattering loudly against the stone. She landed hard on her hands and knees, her expensive, perfectly styled hair falling forward to hide her face as she let out a loud, agonizing wail. Chloe, who was still kneeling on the floor near Preston, looked over at our mother in absolute horror. The golden child was watching her entire support system evaporate into thin air. Her fake rich husband was going to federal prison, and her wealthy mother was now a homeless squatter. The entire toxic ecosystem they had built to oppress me had been completely eradicated in the span of 10 minutes. Beatrice stayed on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, the sound echoing through the quiet ballroom. It was a pathetic, desperate sound. The sound of a bully who had finally been backed into a corner she could never escape from. I stood over her, looking down at the shaking, sobbing mess of a woman who had tried to define my worth. For 32 years, she had made me feel small. She had criticized my clothes, my career, my friends, and finally my husband. She had spent decades making sure I knew that I was a disappointment because I refused to conform to her shallow, empty vision of the world. She had tried to starve me out financially, emotionally, and psychologically. And now she was weeping at my feet, a beggar in a designer dress. I felt absolutely nothing for her. There was no pity, no lingering daughterly affection, no urge to reach down and help her up. The well of my empathy had run completely dry. I had spent my entire youth trying to earn her love, only to realize that she was incapable of loving anything that did not directly benefit her social standing. Seeing her brought low by her own greed was not just vindicating, it was a necessary cleansing of the family tree. The wealthy socialites who had been my mother's closest allies were now physically distancing themselves from the spectacle. They were pulling their chairs back, whispering to each other behind manicured hands. In the ruthless world of Atlanta high society, weakness was a contagion and bankruptcy was a plague. My mother was no longer the queen of Buckhead. She was a cautionary tale. She was the punchline to a joke they would be telling at charity luncheons for the next 10 years. I watched her grasping at the marble floor, her perfectly manicured fingernails scraping against the cold, hard stone. "Did you think I would never fight back, Mother?" I asked, looking down at her, my voice devoid of any warmth. "Did you honestly believe you could just keep taking and taking and taking without ever facing the consequences? You stole my college fund to buy Chloe a handbag. You pushed me out of family photos because my clothes were not expensive enough. You invited your friends here today specifically to humiliate me on the happiest day of my life. You thought I was weak because I chose peace over your constant drama. But peace is not weakness. Peace is what you build when you are quietly acquiring the power to destroy the people who disturb it. Marcus stepped up beside me. He did not say a word to my mother. He did not even look down at her. He just placed his hand on the small of my back, a solid, unwavering presence that reminded me exactly why I was fighting this battle. My mother had tried to shame this man to make him feel inferior because he chose to educate black children instead of exploiting black wealth. She had let Preston mock him and she had laughed. Now Marcus was standing tall in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, watching the woman who insulted him grovel on the floor of a country club she could no longer afford to enter. I walked over to the edge of the head table, where the fake Tiffany box still lay discarded on the floor. I picked it up, feeling the heavy lead weights glued into the bottom. It was such a perfectly poetic representation of my mother's entire existence. Heavy on the outside, completely hollow on the inside. I carried the box back over to where Beatrice was kneeling, and I dropped it on the marble floor right in front of her face. The box bounced once the lid popping off to reveal the empty velvet interior. "There is your empty future, mother," I said, my voice ringing with finality. "Take a good look at it because it is the only thing you own now. You gave everything you had to Preston and Chloe, and they squandered it. You tried to destroy my marriage, and instead you handed me the deed to your entire life. You are going to wake up tomorrow morning with no house, no money, and no legacy. You are going to have to look your wealthy friends in the eye and explain why your quiet, disappointing daughter is the one holding the keys to the Caldwell mansion." The heavy silence that followed my final words was suddenly shattered by a sharp, shrill sound. It was a cell phone ringing. The ringing was relentless, a piercing electronic tone that cut through the thick, suffocating atmosphere of the Buckhead Country Club. Every eye in the room darted toward the noise. It was coming from the inside pocket of Preston's tailored suit jacket. He was still kneeling amidst the scattered shards of his broken champagne glass, his eyes wide and vacant. The phone vibrated against his chest, a physical reminder that the real world, the world of legal consequences and federal investigations, was eagerly waiting for him on the other end of the line. Chloe stopped crying for a fraction of a second. She stared at her husband, her chest heaving with erratic, ragged breaths. "Answer it!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "Answer the phone, Preston. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them you did not steal anything. Fix this right now." Preston slowly moved his arm. His movements were jerky and uncoordinated like a marionette with broken strings. He reached into his jacket pocket, his hand trembling so violently he could barely secure a grip on the device. He pulled the phone out and brought the glowing screen up to his face. The bright blue light illuminated the sweat rolling down his pale, terrified cheeks. I did not need to be close enough to read the caller ID. I had timed the release of the documents to the FBI and Vanguard compliance perfectly. I knew exactly what type of incoming call could reduce a man like Preston to a shaking puddle of fear. He stared at the screen, and a broken, pathetic whimper escaped his lips. His fingers went limp. The phone dropped from his hand, clattering against the marble floor and sliding until it bumped gently against Chloe's expensive designer shoe. The screen remained lit, flashing a corporate number that spelled the absolute end of his freedom. Chloe looked down at the vibrating phone and then back up at the hollow, empty face of the man she had married. The final thread of her denial snapped. The golden child of the Caldwell family, the woman who had spent her entire life believing she was infinitely superior to me, finally understood the gravity of her situation. She was not a wealthy socialite. She was the wife of a desperate criminal. The luxury vacations, the designer bags, the penthouse condo, it was all built on stolen money. And now it was all gone. The realization completely broke her mind. She let out a guttural, agonizing scream and launched herself across the small space separating them. She fell to her knees right in front of Preston, her perfectly manicured hands balling into tight fists. She began striking him, hitting his chest, his shoulders, his arms with wild, chaotic flails. "You ruined my life!" she shrieked, slapping him across the face with a loud, sharp crack. You promised me we were rich. You promised me a penthouse. You stole from my sister, and now we have nothing. You made me broke, Preston. You made me poor. You are a pathetic lying loser. Preston did not even raise his arms to defend himself. He just sat there on his knees, letting his hysterical wife slap and punch him while he stared blankly ahead. The prominent guests in the ballroom watched this spectacular meltdown with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. The elite members of Atlanta high society, the very people Chloe had spent years desperately trying to impress, were now witnessing her total absolute degradation. Her custom silk dress was tangled around her knees. Her hair was a mess and she was wailing like a spoiled, petulant child whose favorite toy had been snatched away forever. But while Chloe was busy physically attacking her fraudulent husband, the true mastermind behind my lifetime of suffering was still groveling at my feet. My mother Beatrice had been staring at the empty Tiffany box I had purposefully dropped in front of her. The reality of her impending eviction was finally sinking deep into her bones. She had no money. She had no house. She had no legacy. Her golden child was married to a future federal inmate, and her despised scapegoat daughter was the anonymous billionaire holding the deed to her entire existence. Beatrice slowly looked up at me. The mask of the proud, arrogant matriarch was entirely gone, stripped away by the sheer force of her own colossal failure. Her face was a ruin of smeared mascara and flowing tears. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, raw desperation that I had never seen in her before. For my entire 32 years of life, she had looked at me with disappointment, with contempt, with a cold, calculating judgment. But right now, kneeling on the floor of the country club, she was looking at me with pure, unadulterated fear. She reached out her hands, trembling violently, and grabbed the delicate silk fabric of my wedding dress. Her knuckles turned white as she clung to the hem of my gown, as if holding on to the material could somehow stop the ground from opening up and swallowing her whole. She pulled herself forward, dragging her knees across the cold, hard marble until she was looking straight up at me from the floor. "Nia, baby," she cried, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine that echoed through the quiet room. "Nia, please, you have to listen to me. I was just joking. The box, the speech, the comments about your husband. It was all just a joke. A silly, stupid joke. You know how I am, baby. I just have a terrible sense of humor. I did not mean any of it. You cannot take my house away, Nia. You cannot do this to me." Real, genuine tears were pouring down her cheeks now. They were not the fake, calculated tears she used to manipulate my father or to gain sympathy from her country club friends. These were the visceral tears of a woman who was staring directly into the abyss of her own creation. She was clutching my dress so tightly that I could feel the heavy fabric pulling against my waist. "Please, Nia," Beatrice begged, her voice rising in pitch. Everyone was watching her beg. The powerful women she had gossiped with, the politicians she had funded, the pastors she had charmed. They were all watching the undisputed queen of Buckhead grovel on her knees at the feet of the daughter she had publicly humiliated. "We are family, Nia. We are blood. You are my firstborn child. I gave you life. You cannot throw your own mother out on the street. You cannot leave me homeless. I will change. I promise you I will change. I will do whatever you want. Just please give me back the deed to the house." I looked down at the pathetic woman clutching my dress. I looked at the dark streaks of makeup running down her face. I looked at the raw panic twisting her features. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of daughterly obligation. I searched my soul for a single drop of pity for the woman who had brought me into this world. But there was absolutely nothing there. She had systematically burned every bridge, every connection, every ounce of love I had ever held for her. She had chosen superficial status over my mental and financial well-being. She had chosen Chloe's shallow vanity over my future. She had chosen a fake wealthy white son-in-law over the loyal, brilliant black man I had married. I took a slow, deliberate step backward. The movement was firm and unyielding. The delicate silk of my wedding gown slipped right out of her grasping, trembling hands. Her fingers swiped at the empty air, trying desperately to catch the fabric again, but I stepped further back, putting a cold, undeniable physical distance between us. Beatrice fell forward slightly, her hands hitting the marble floor empty. I stood tall, looking down at her with an expression of absolute glacial indifference. The fire and the anger that had carried me through the beginning of this confrontation had completely burned out, leaving behind a cold, calculating serenity. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with the quiet, lethal authority of a woman who had already won the war. An empty box for an empty future, right? Mother, I said, repeating the exact words she had used to humiliate me just half an hour ago. My voice carried perfectly across the room, smooth and deadly. That is what you said to me in front of all these people. You handed me a hollow prop and told me my marriage was worthless. You stood at that microphone and proudly declared that you were washing your hands of my decisions. You told me that when I failed, I would not have the Caldwell fortune to fall back on. Beatrice sobbed, shaking her head frantically. No, please, I did not mean it. I was just trying to push you. I just wanted you to be successful. I am successful, mother. I replied, my tone entirely devoid of emotion. I am more successful than you have ever been in your entire miserable life. But the difference between you and me is that I built my empire on hard work and intelligence, while you built your pathetic illusion on theft and manipulation. You did not push me to be successful. You tried to bury me so Chloe could shine. You stole my education fund so you could pretend you were raising Atlanta elite. You leveraged the family estate so you could keep buying custom gowns and hosting charity dinners to impress people who are currently watching you grovel on the floor like a common thief. I looked over at Chloe, who was still slapping Preston on the chest, sobbing and screaming about her ruined life. Then I looked back down at the woman who had created this toxic monster of a family. You talk about family, mother. I continued, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom. You beg me not to throw you out on the street because we share blood. But family does not exploit each other. Family does not steal from their own children. Family does not invite guests to a wedding specifically to publicly humiliate the bride. You chose to stop being my mother a long time ago, Beatrice. You chose to be a parasite. And I do not negotiate with parasites. Beatrice let out a long, agonizing wail. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. She curled into a ball on the floor, hiding her face in her arms, as the reality of her total destruction finally locked into place. She had no leverage left. She had no money. She had no house. She had no reputation. The elite friends she had sacrificed my future to impress were now staring at her with cold, judgmental eyes. They were not going to invite her to their galas anymore. They were not going to offer her a guest room. She was a pariah in the only world she had ever cared about. Marcus stepped up beside me again, placing his hand gently on my shoulder. He looked down at my mother, and then over at Preston and Chloe. His expression was calm, completely unbothered by the dramatic meltdown happening at our feet. He had endured their racist microaggressions, their condescension, and their blatant disrespect for years. And now he was watching his brilliant, powerful wife completely dismantle their entire existence without ever raising a hand. Nana, Josephine leaned on her carved wooden cane a few feet away, watching the scene with a dark, satisfied smile. She had waited decades for this moment. She had waited for the day the rotting branches of the Caldwell family tree were finally pruned away. She nodded at me, a silent gesture of absolute respect and approval. I had done exactly what needed to be done. I had protected the legacy, and I had protected myself. The ballroom was thick with a heavy finalizing tension. The performance was over. The grand finale had been executed perfectly. The villains were broken weeping on the floor of a country club. They no longer had any right to be inside. But I was not quite finished yet. There was still the matter of clearing the room and stepping fully into the future I had built. The eviction was coming, and it was going to be the most satisfying moment of my entire life. I looked down at the sobbing mess of the woman who used to be the terrifying matriarch of the Caldwell family. The ballroom was still holding its collective breath, waiting to see how I would dispose of the remains of her shattered empire. The air was thick with the expensive perfumes and colognes of the Atlanta elite, all of them watching the complete destruction of the family they had feared and respected for decades. Beatrice was still clutching the marble floor, her tears leaving dark smudges on the polished stone. I took a slow breath, letting the cool air of the country club fill my lungs. "You have exactly 24 hours," I said, my voice ringing with a cold, absolute authority that left no room for negotiation or mercy. 24 hours to go back to Buckhead, pack whatever clothes and personal items you can fit into a few suitcases, and get out of my house. I am sending a private security team tomorrow evening at exactly 8 o'clock. If you are still inside that mansion when they arrive, they have strict orders to physically remove you and change all the locks. You will not take the art, you will not take the antique furniture, and you certainly will not take the silver that Nana Josephine bought with her own hard-earned money. You will leave with exactly what you brought into this world, which is nothing. I turned my attention to my sister Chloe, who had finally stopped hitting Preston and was now sitting on the floor staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "And you, Chloe?" I continued, my tone flattening into pure disgust. "You and your fraudulent husband are no longer welcome on any property associated with my name or my company. The downtown condo you live in, the one bought with my stolen tuition money, is currently under review by the Apex Capital legal team. You might want to start looking for a cheap apartment outside the city perimeter, because the federal authorities are going to freeze every single bank account tied to Preston's name by Monday morning. You wanted to be married to a wealthy finance bro so badly that you never stopped to ask whose money he was spending to keep you draped in designer labels. Now you get to be the wife of a federal inmate with zero assets and a mountain of legal debt. I hope the fake Rolex and the empty lifestyle were worth the absolute ruin of your future." I did not wait for their pathetic responses. I lifted my hand and made a subtle, deliberate motion toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. The head of security for the Buckhead Country Club, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Mr. Davis, immediately stepped forward. He was flanked by 4 other large security guards, all wearing crisp, dark suits with discreet earpieces. They marched down the center aisle, their heavy footsteps echoing against the marble floor, moving with undeniable purpose toward the head table where the villains of my story were currently groveling in their own spectacular failure. Beatrice saw the guards approaching, and a fresh wave of panic washed over her tear-stained face. She scrambled backward, pushing herself up onto her trembling legs, grabbing the edge of a nearby guest table to keep from collapsing again. "Mr. Davis!" She cried out, her voice shrill and desperate as she tried to summon the last pathetic shreds of her fake high society persona. "Mr. Davis, remove this woman immediately. I am Beatrice Caldwell. I am a platinum tier member of this club. My family has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in this establishment over the decades. I demand that you escort Nia and her husband off the premises right now. You work for me, do you hear me? You work for the elite members of this club, and I demand that you remove these people from my sight before I have you fired." Mr. Davis did not even look at her. His expression was completely blank, an absolute wall of professional indifference to her hysterical screaming. He walked straight past. My mother stopped directly in front of me and gave a deep, respectful bow. "What are your orders, ma'am?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly over the silence of the awestruck crowd. Beatrice let out a choked gasp, clutching her chest, as if she had just been physically struck by a heavy stone. She stared at the head of security, unable to comprehend why the staff she had belittled and commanded 4 decades was now bowing to the daughter she despised so deeply. I smiled, a slow, cold smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I looked at my mother, soaking in the absolute total confusion and terror radiating from her entire body. "Did you really think your platinum membership meant anything, Mother?" I asked, letting a soft, dark chuckle escape my lips. "Did you think you could host a wedding at the most exclusive venue in Buckhead without me running a full financial background check on the property? The Buckhead Country Club has been operating at a massive loss for the past 3 years." I explained, speaking slowly, so every single word could tear down another pillar of her fake reality. "The board of directors was desperate for a cash injection to avoid selling this historic land to commercial developers who wanted to pave over your precious golf courses. So they quietly put the controlling shares of the club up for private auction last month. And once again, Mother, you failed to pay attention to the name on the dotted line of the corporate acquisition documents." I took a step closer to her, watching the final light of hope completely extinguish in her horrified eyes. The realization was crashing down on her like a tidal wave of pure financial dominance. As for tonight, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal carrying whisper that was picked up perfectly by the microphone. Please escort these three off the premises, Mr. Davis. Oh, and Beatrice, I own this country club now too. The security guards immediately moved into formation, a tight organized wall of dark suits enclosing the three people who had spent my entire life trying to destroy me. Mr. Davis stepped right up to my mother, gesturing firmly toward the exit doors with an outstretched arm. It is time to leave the property now. Ma'am, Mr. Davis said, his tone completely stripped of the customer service warmth he usually reserved for paying members. Beatrice shook her head frantically, fresh tears ruining what was left of her expensive custom makeup. She looked around the ballroom, begging her wealthy friends for help, with her wild, desperate eyes searching for any sign of loyalty among the vipers she called her peers. Please, she sobbed, reaching a trembling hand out toward Judge Miller, who was sitting at the nearest table. Charles, please, you have known me for 20 years. Tell them they cannot do this. Tell them I belong here. I am a fixture of this community. Judge Miller slowly turned his head away, picking up his crystal water glass and taking a slow, deliberate sip, intentionally ignoring her pathetic pleas for salvation. The other prominent socialites, the women who had attended my mother's lavish garden parties and drank her stolen champagne, actively, physically recoiled as she looked in their direction. They pulled their expensive silk shawls tighter around their shoulders, turning their backs on her, whispering harsh, severe judgments to their husbands. In the ruthless, unforgiving world of the Atlanta elite, there was absolutely no mercy for a fraud who had been publicly executed and exposed by her own blood. Beatrice was a walking virus of bankruptcy and scandal, and no one in that room was going to risk their own pristine reputation to save a woman who stole from her own child to fund a fake lifestyle. Two of the large security guards moved over to where Preston was still kneeling in the shattered remains of his champagne glass. He had not moved a single muscle since I told him the FBI had his files. He was completely catatonic, a hollow, empty shell of a man whose brain had simply shut down to protect itself from the sheer magnitude of his impending federal prison sentence. The guards reached down and grabbed him by the arms, hauling him roughly to his feet. Preston did not resist at all. His head hung limply forward, his chin resting on his chest, his expensive leather shoes dragging across the marble floor, leaving a wet trail of spilled champagne and broken crystal in his wake. He was a dead man walking a ghost being escorted out of a life he never actually earned and into a nightmare of concrete cells and orange jumpsuits. Chloe was a completely different story. As the guards approached her, the golden child of the Caldwell dynasty completely lost whatever fragile grip she had left on her sanity. She began to thrash and scream, fighting against the security team like a wild, cornered animal. "Get your hands off me!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the high-painted ceilings of the ballroom. "Do you know who I am? I am Chloe Caldwell. I wear designer clothes. I live in a penthouse. You cannot touch me. You are just security guards and I am rich. I am rich. Do you hear me? I am better than all of you." It was the most pathetic display of delusion I had ever witnessed in my entire life. She was screaming about wealth she did not possess in a building she no longer had the right to stand inside. The security guards ignored her hysterical screaming easily, grabbing her by the elbows and marching her firmly toward the center aisle. She thrashed and kicked, her expensive designer heels slipping on the polished stone, her custom gown ripping slightly at the seams as she fought against their unbreakable professional grip. Beatrice, seeing her golden child being physically dragged out of the country club, let out one final agonizing wail of pure defeat. She collapsed against Mr. Davis, who simply caught her by the arm and began marching her down the aisle right behind her sobbing sister and her catatonic son-in-law. The procession of the defeated villains was a masterpiece of absolute total humiliation. They were being paraded right down the center aisle of the ballroom, forced to walk past every single one of the 250 prominent guests they had tried so desperately to impress with their fake wealth and their cruel jokes. The same aisle my mother had confidently strutted down to hand me that empty box just an hour ago was now the path of her ultimate, inescapable destruction. Cameras were flashing from the crowd. Several of the younger guests had pulled out their cell phones, quietly recording the spectacular downfall of the fake Buckhead royalty. The video of Chloe screaming about her designer clothes while being dragged out by security would undoubtedly be circulating through every elite group chat in Atlanta before the night was even over. Their social annihilation was absolute broadcast live to the exact audience they worshipped. The whispers and scoffs of the crowd followed them every step of the way, a brutal chorus of judgment that would haunt them for the rest of their miserable lives. I stood at the head table watching them go, feeling a profound, deep-seated peace settling into my very bones. The heavy toxic weight I had carried on my shoulders for 32 years evaporated completely, leaving me feeling light, powerful, and entirely free. Marcus wrapped his strong, solid arm around my waist, pulling me close against his side. He pressed a soft, warm kiss to my temple, a silent testament to the unyielding partnership we shared. We had weathered their racist microaggressions, their toxic manipulation, and their desperate attempts to break our bond, and we had emerged entirely victorious. Nana Josephine tapped her carved wooden cane against the floor one more time, a rhythmic, satisfying sound of approval. She watched her disgraced daughter and her spoiled granddaughter being shoved toward the heavy oak doors of the ballroom, her face a mask of cold, hard, unyielding justice. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom slammed shut with a loud, definitive boom, sealing the three of them outside in the cold, dark night air. The toxic poison that had infected my life since childhood was finally completely removed from my presence. They were gone. They were broke. They were homeless. They were facing federal indictments and total social eradication. And I was standing in the center of a multi-million-dollar property that I owned completely free and clear, surrounded by people who respected me, holding the hand of a man who truly loved me. My eyes drifted down to the floor near the edge of the head table. The empty Tiffany blue box still lay discarded on the marble, a pathetic, useless piece of cardboard that represented nothing but the lies of a failed matriarch. I lifted the hem of my beautiful white wedding dress and kicked the box gently with the toe of my shoe, pushing it under the table into the dark shadows where it belonged. The trash had officially been taken out, and the real celebration of my beautiful, authentic life was finally ready to begin. The heavy double doors remained shut, and for the first time all evening, the air in the Buckhead Country Club felt entirely clean. It was as if a massive, suffocating vacuum had been lifted from the ballroom. The dark, toxic energy that my mother and sister had dragged into this sacred space was gone, completely erased from the premises. I stood there at the head table listening to the quiet murmur of the crowd slowly returning to life. The prominent guests, the judges and executives and socialites who had watched the absolute destruction of the Caldwell villains were collectively exhaling. They were adjusting their suits and smoothing their silk dresses, the initial shock morphing into a profound, undeniable respect for what had just transpired. I had not just removed my abusers from the room, I had surgically extracted a cancer that had been poisoning my family tree for decades. The catering staff, who had been standing frozen against the walls like statues, suddenly sprang back into motion. They moved with a renewed lightness, stepping around the spilled champagne and the broken crystal glass that Preston had dropped. No one even bothered to clean it up right away, leaving it there as a glittering monument to his total financial and social ruin. The suffocating tension that had gripped the venue was replaced by an electric buzzing energy. The elite members of the crowd were whispering to each other, but it was no longer the cruel gossip my mother thrived on. It was the stunned, reverent whispering of people who had just witnessed a masterclass in absolute dominance. They knew that the hierarchy of Atlanta had just shifted permanently, and I was the one standing at the very top of the new food chain. I slowly turned my body away from the exit doors and looked up at the man standing beside me. Marcus had not moved from my side for a single second. His hand was still resting gently on the small of my back, a steady, unwavering anchor that had kept me grounded while the hurricane tore through the room. I looked into his deep brown eyes, and what I saw there took my breath away. There was no fear. There was no intimidation at the sudden, staggering revelation of my massive hidden wealth. There was only pure, unfiltered awe and an immense swelling pride. He looked at me like I was a superhero who had just saved the world from a disaster. He knew the agonizing pain I had endured at the hands of those people. He had held me on the nights when my mother's cruel words had driven me to tears. He had watched me build Apex Capital from a small, cramped office working 80-hour weeks while quietly swallowing the insults of a family who thought I was nothing. And now he was looking at the woman who had finally claimed her ultimate undeniable victory. "You are absolutely magnificent," my husband whispered, his voice, a deep, soothing rumble that only I could hear over the rising chatter of the ballroom. His hands moved to cup my face, his thumbs gently brushing across my cheekbones. I leaned into his touch, feeling the absolute safety and security that Preston and Chloe could only ever dream of faking. Marcus did not need an $80,000 down payment from stolen funds to prove he was a man. His wealth was in his character, his integrity, and the fiercely protective way he loved me. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him close. The kiss we shared right then in front of all of Atlanta high society was not just a symbol of our marriage, it was a seal of absolute triumph. It was passionate and deep and entirely real, erasing every single bitter memory of the empty box my mother had tried to force upon us. We were standing on a foundation of genuine love and unwavering loyalty, a foundation that no amount of petty jealousy could ever crack. When we finally pulled away from each other, the guests erupted into spontaneous applause. It started with my husband's fraternity brothers, in the back of the room, clapping loudly and cheering for the man who had maintained his dignity in the face of blatant racism and disrespect. The applause quickly spread, rippling through the elite tables until the entire ballroom was on its feet, giving us a standing ovation. It was not the polite, forced golf clap of high society. It was a genuine, thunderous roar of approval. They were celebrating the fall of the fake queen and the rise of the real one. Through the noise, I heard the familiar solid tap of Nana Josephine's cane. The crowd parted for her once again as she stepped right up to the center of the head table. The matriarch of the Caldwell dynasty was beaming, her eyes sparkling with a fierce, joyful light that erased years from her weathered face. A waiter practically materialized out of thin air, rushing over with a silver tray to offer her a fresh crystal glass of champagne. Nana took the glass with a graceful nod, raising it high into the air. She tapped her cane one more time against the marble floor, demanding the attention of every single person in the room. The applause slowly faded, transitioning back into a respectful, eager silence. Nana Josephine looked at me, her chest swelling with generational pride. She then turned her gaze out to the sea of wealthy, powerful guests who were waiting on her every word. She brought the wireless microphone up to her lips, a wicked, satisfied grin spreading across her face. "Now that the pests are gone," she announced, her raspy voice vibrating with absolute joy, "let us celebrate a real marriage." The ballroom absolutely exploded. The cheer that went up from the crowd was deafening, a massive wave of relief and celebration that completely washed away any lingering tension. Nana raised her glass to her lips and took a triumphant sip, signaling that the time for war was officially over and the time for joy had finally begun. At the back of the stage, the band leader, who had been standing frozen in shock for the past 45 minutes, immediately caught the cue. He spun around and pointed his baton at the brass section. A single bright blast from a trumpet cut through the cheering crowd, followed instantly by the heavy, infectious bass line of a joyful, upbeat rhythm and blues track. It was a classic soul song, the kind of music that reaches right into your heart and demands that you move. The music swelled, filling the massive space with a rich, vibrant energy that made it impossible to stand still. It was the sound of black joy, pure and unadulterated, rising from the ashes of a toxic spectacle. Marcus grabbed my hand, his face breaking into a massive, radiant smile. He pulled me out from behind the head table, leading me right into the center of the polished marble dance floor. My heavy white wedding gown swirled around my legs as he spun me effortlessly, making me laugh out loud for the first time all evening. The laughter bubbled up from deep inside my chest, genuine and entirely free. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the quiet sister standing in the shadows of a fake golden child. I was Nia Caldwell, the founder and CEO of Apex Capital, a woman who had just reclaimed her entire life. Nana Josephine did not return to her seat. She stepped right onto the dance floor with us, tapping her cane to the beat of the music, her shoulders swaying with a rhythm that defied her 78 years. The guests flooded the floor around us, leaving their expensive dinners and half-empty wine glasses behind. The rigid, stuffy atmosphere of the Buckhead Country Club melted away, replaced by the warm, vibrant energy of a real, authentic celebration. Even the wealthy judges and corporate executives were loosening their ties and clapping their hands to the music, swept up in the magnetic joy of a family that had finally healed itself by cutting off its rotting branches. As the bass thumped through the soles of my shoes, vibrating through the marble floor and up into my very bones, I realized the magnitude of what had actually been accomplished tonight. For years, I had carried the heavy burden of my mother's relentless disappointment. I had internalized every backhanded compliment, every pointed sigh, every comparison to my sister that was designed to make me feel small and insignificant. I had spent my 20s exhausted, constantly trying to prove my worth to a woman who was incapable of seeing anything beyond a price tag. But swirling around this dance floor with the bright lights of the chandeliers, catching the joy in my husband's eyes, that burden was completely, permanently eradicated. The little girl who used to hide in the corners of the Caldwell estate, wishing she was enough, had finally grown up into a titan who bought the estate out from under them. The party around us reached a fever pitch. The waiters were weaving through the dancing crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne and appetizers, their faces bearing wide, genuine smiles. The stuffy, aristocratic pretension that usually choked the life out of these high society gatherings had been completely banished. We were no longer putting on a show for the sake of appearances. We were celebrating survival. We were celebrating the absolute triumph of substance over superficiality. I saw my husband's colleagues, the dedicated teachers and public servants who had been mocked by Preston earlier, now laughing and clinking glasses with millionaire investors. The invisible lines of class and status that my mother had spent her life trying to enforce had been completely erased by the sheer, undeniable force of authenticity. I danced with my husband, feeling his strong arms holding me secure. I danced with my grandmother, the brilliant, ruthless visionary, who had seen the fire inside me and handed me the match to burn the fake empire down. I looked around the room, watching the people I loved smiling and celebrating without a single ounce of pretense or manipulation holding us back. The heavy mahogany box was safely secured behind the head table, guarding the documents that had guaranteed my total victory. The empty Tiffany box was long forgotten, kicked into the dark shadows beneath the silk tablecloths, exactly where it belonged. This was what true power felt like. It was not the ability to humiliate others, or the desperation to flaunt fake wealth to people who did not care. True power was the absolute, unshakable freedom to be exactly who you are. It was the ability to protect the people you love and the strength to completely eradicate anyone who tried to harm them. My mother had wanted to hand me an empty future, but instead she had forced me to claim the entire world. I leaned my head against my husband's chest, closing my eyes and letting the deep, soulful rhythm of the music wash over me. I was stepping into my future as a wildly successful, fiercely independent woman who had taken her power back, and nobody would ever dare to hand me an empty box again. The greatest lesson from this journey is that your worth is never defined by toxic family members who project their insecurities onto you. True power does not need to boast, belittle, or seek external validation. While others waste energy maintaining fake appearances and tearing people down, you must build your empire in absolute silence. Blood simply makes you relatives, but respect, loyalty, and unconditional support are what truly make a family. Never be afraid to set ruthless boundaries and walk away from those who hand you empty boxes. If this story empowered you, hit subscribe and share your thoughts below.